The Patch. Steve rolled to a stop at a fork in the road and turned to Ayanna. She blinked her warm mahogany eyes, lips painted a glossy red. He couldn't fathom why she wanted to spend their first date out here in the middle of nowhere, but he was grateful that she did. "Which way?" he asked. She nodded to the right, and he eased the old truck around the bend. A legion of crickets chirped as they passed haphazard rows of pumpkins. The autumn breeze was crisp. It carried the ripe, earthy scent of crops and rustled the leaves on their vines. The pumpkins seemed to grow taller and fatter the deeper into the patch they drove. His gaze drifted once again to Ayanna. She was dressed as a Native American princess, and she looked every bit the part. Her high cheekbones and sable hair, stunning eyebrows, and dark olive skin really tied the costume together. She sat with her feet propped up on the dash, wiggling her toes, and Steve fought the urge to trace the curves of her legs with his eyes. "Great costume." "Thanks. Real original, huh?" she giggled. "I never celebrated Halloween as a kid, so when it comes to dressing up, I guess I decided to stick with what's familiar." She looked down at her toes. "It's sad, really, if you think about it. To see the beadwork, the beautiful fringed pelts, and the hand-woven garments of my people reduced to this. A cheap cotton miniskirt with knotted tassels and an elastic headband with artificial feathers glued to the front." She rolled her eyes. The package even said, "Sexy Indian." Steve wasn't sure how to respond, so he watched the pumpkins roll by outside his window. They looked plumper and rounder as they traveled. He'd seen a photo of a 2,000-pound pumpkin once, and he thought some of these looked just as big, if not bigger. He wondered how much further they had to go. Ayanna had insisted on coming here. She said the stars shine brighter in the middle of this field than anywhere else in Michigan. Yet something about being alone with these gourds, which were 5 and even 10 times his size, it unnerved him. "So, what tribe did your family belong to?" "Not did. We are Wyandot. Grandfather reminds me every day. Most of my ancestors were forced to move during the Indian Removal Act of 1830, but those of us who remain strive to honor our heritage." He shook his head. "I'm sorry to hear that, about your family moving away." She looked at him, the side of her mouth forming a half smirk. She leaned in close and put a hand on his thigh. "I like you," she whispered in his ear. Lightning flickered, illuminating the clouds. Steve recognized it as heat lightning because it wasn't accompanied by rain or thunder. The night sky flashed like a strobe light behind rows of enormous pumpkins. The wind picked up, whipping the leaves. Steve's skin tingled where she touched him. Her fingers felt amazing, even through his jeans. He wondered how much further he had to drive. She nuzzled her soft hair against his shoulder, and her closeness made his heart begin to pound. That's when he noticed it. A strange movement in the fields. The pumpkins seemed to swell and pulsate, throbbing in time with his heart. He blinked and rubbed his eyes, but the motion continued, a rhythmic vibration up and down the rows. They came to a clearing at the end of the road. Massive pumpkins formed a circle around it. Steve couldn't see anything beyond those giant gourds, and he suddenly felt very small. He barely had time to put the truck in park and kill the engine before Ayanna sprang from her seat, leaving the door hanging open. She danced through the clearing, heading for a large flat stone near its center. Her hips swayed, body undulating to the tempo of the strange, silent lightning that lit up the clouds. And the clouds, they swirled unnaturally fast. And then, he couldn't believe it. Ayanna gripped the bottom of her brown halter top and yanked it over her head. She stood atop the flat rock, topless and dancing. She beckoned with her finger for Steve to come. He practically leapt from the truck. He approached her, stepping onto the stone. She wiggled her hips, moved close to him. "You're not shy," he said, smiling. No, I am proud to be woman. She lifted her chin. Wyandotte legend says that the first human was a woman who fell from the heavens. Just like you, he said. She grinned at him, gyrating her hips. The lightning flashed, casting eerie shadows across her features. Her rhythmic movements were fluid and hypnotic. Steve couldn't look away. This woman who fell from the sky, she gave birth to a daughter who gave birth to twin boys. One of the boys was evil and decided to kill his mother during childbirth. She smiled. I know this all sounds like nonsense, but my favorite part is next. She did a spin, then faced him again. The first crop sprang from her body when she was buried in the earth. Maize from her chest, beans from her legs, and the pumpkins, they grew from her head. Ayanna threw herself into the dance. All around, the pumpkins thumped like the beating of 1,000 hearts. Their steady rhythm grew louder. Her eyes rolled. She whipped her head from side to side and shook her ass, arms pumping to the beat of the crops as they pulsed, vines swelling and deflating like arteries. Steve broke a sweat, no longer turned on, but terrified. Maybe we should go, he said, pointing to the sky. Heat lightning is a warning that a storm is coming. She slowed her movement enough to steady her breathing. Do you know why that's my favorite part, Steve? About the crops growing from her body? She glared at him, and the lightning flickered, distorting her beauty into something sinister. Her bare breasts glistened with sweat. She moved close, and he found himself unable to avoid her predatory advance. She was on him in an instant, hot breath in his ear canal. Her lips caressed his earlobe as she whispered, "Because it's just like these crops." She pulled away, stared at him. Her pupils swirled, two black pits of madness. You see, my family has an arrangement with the crops. They grow big and ripe every year, and in return, we offer a sacrifice. Something like regret wrinkled her brow. I'm sorry, it has to be you. Her palms slammed into his chest, and he flew back, landing a few feet from the rock with his ass against the cold, hard earth. He was dead center of the clearing. He realized that now. And the vines, they moved like snakes through the grass, slithering away from the pumpkins and into the brush. Tall weeds shook from side to side as the vines came at him from every direction, moving through the grass so fast he didn't have time to react. They coiled around his ankles, inching up his shins. They twined around his wrists. He screamed and tried to struggle free, but he was no match for their speed and strength. The grip on his limbs tightened as Steve was pulled in every direction. A vine slithered down his throat, but it didn't silence his screams. He shrieked and writhed and only fell silent once his appendages were torn from his torso, body ripped to bloody pieces. The gory chunks of meat were dragged down into the hungry soil. Ayanna frowned. She didn't enjoy watching him die, but Steve would live on through the crops. She'd been raised to respect the land, to tend it, and feed it. She only did what had to be done. Her name had meant eternal bloom in those early days when her people had roamed the wild plains. Her ancestors were gone, many forgotten, but their gods still held dominion over Earth. As long as her family's land continued to thrive, she would continue to sate the gods. And this land would thrive as long as she lived.